Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our inaugural. We're going to call this series Food for the Journey. This is a chance for Deacon Becky and I'm Father Justin, the rector at Christ Church, and Deacon Becky's our deacon here at Christ Church, where we're going to just take a few moments and talk a little bit about the readings that are coming up for this coming Sunday. And I think Food for the Journey is kind of a neat way to think about what we're doing, because we're hoping this will get you thinking about the scripture that you're going to hear on Sunday and get you reflecting as we reflect to prepare sermons and to prepare worship. You can join in that work with us as you explore these readings prior to coming to church on Sunday. So Sunday, we're both going to be there, but I am not going to be the preacher, which I'm super excited about. Becky is going to be the preacher, and I will get to listen to her. So I'm going to let Becky, we've got a good set of readings, and I'm going to let Becky start us off with our reading from 1 Samuel chapter 1, 4 through 20. And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, 1 Samuel is very important, actually, historically, because it talks about Eli, who was one of the judges in Israel, but also one of the priests in Israel, and perhaps a prophet. And he is ministering as priest, and Hannah comes. Hannah has a husband. She also has another woman in the family who has children. Hannah doesn't, and as a woman, that's a dilemma. She is very sorrowful. It puts her in a second place position.
And let's just so we're clear, Hannah's husband has another wife.
That's correct.
Who has children.
That's right. Did I say
so? No, that's
yeah,
good. That's good. I think that's the first thing that jumps out at you in these Old Testament texts sometimes is the world in which they are operating is not always similar to our world. We don't know. I mean, maybe there are some folks who have multiple spouses, but most of the time in our day and age, we're used to one spouse. And that's not true in the time of Samuel and this time of Hannah. It's not uncommon for there to be multiple spouses and then children from each wife. And when I say spouses, I want to be even more specific. In this time, it's not unusual for a man to have multiple wives. It'd be very unusual for a wife to have multiple husbands. It's very patriarchal in that way. And I think that's important because I think it sets this kind of context that you're talking about Hannah being, she didn't have a child.
She didn't have a child.
Her sister wife, if you will, does.
Right. And it's one of the things that flows through. Rachel had another sister wife. Rebecca had another sister wife. So it's not uncommon throughout, and they were all barren women, which is exactly what we have with Hannah. She is childless, and she desperately wants a child, and she presents that in front of Eli, but she is talking to God. So much talking to God that Eli thinks she's drunk.
Isn't it funny in our life when we probably all can think of a person, right? You probably can think of a story of somebody in our life that we deemed holy, maybe. Or maybe we deemed them weird.
Weird.
Because of their perceived closeness to God, that they almost in a weird way were closer to God than we were, and then that was strange, so then you kind of push them off to the side.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's such human nature. We don't know what to do when somebody is so faithful as Hannah is to God and to trying to turn this concern over. And of course Eli's like, what's wrong with you?
Woman, what's wrong with you? Are you drunk? And then when she told him what her dilemma was, it's almost as if he says, well, if you talk to God, that's good enough. Go in peace. And I think he forgot about it. That was just another woman that was there, a little bit different. But she heard something, and of course we know that later on she gave birth to Samuel.
And what do we make of that, you think, of this kind of story? What's that kind of tell us maybe about Yahweh or God in this instance? think there's some important things that you're touching on.
Well, there may be that God has a purpose for everyone, even the barren wife, and maybe has had a purpose, and she perhaps was able to catch on to it. That Eli was there as judge and as priest in this situation, but not really in touch with what was going on, perhaps with God. But we don't have to know everything that God is doing. In our world around us, there is so much going on that we don't honestly know about. We come in contact with it, and then later on we see the revelation of it.
Well, and then you see, in kind of connection to that, Hannah remains so faithful.
Yes.
And prayerful. And God responds. And if you kind of take all that context, the patriarchal society, it's just Hannah. She happens to be another wife in this situation. Doesn't have children, but there's other children on the other side of this family tree. And it's such an important part of what she's longing for, and God responds.
God responds.
And I think, to me, there's power in that in this story of God's people, God responds to Hannah. Somebody who, yes, is very famous to us as we know the rest of the story, and we know the child that's going to come. Mm-hmm. And she made a point of that. Deacon Becky made a point of that before this, that's really important. But prior to knowing that, Hannah really wasn't that important of a person.
No.
She was just another woman in a really interesting situation.
And coming to make sacrifices to God. And
she was just faithful, and then God responded. And I think it's important what you were saying is that we don't always know how God's going to respond.
No.
And in Hannah's case, it's exactly what she's going to want. But I think God probably responds in many ways in our lives, and it's the question of how willing we are to open our eyes.
I would agree with that.
To see those promises being fulfilled in our lives. I think it's very interesting. I'm excited to see what you're going to do with that on Sunday.
Well, we'll see. Somebody's told me I can't use notes.
Yes, I told Deacon Becky she can't use notes, but we're going to flip over and talk about the gospel for a minute. Just to give you the full spectrum, each week when we do this Food for the Journey, we're going to talk about both lessons. But I did, just as a segue as we move to the gospel, tell Deacon Becky this week that I think she's going to preach without notes, and we'll see if she loves that. I think she's going to do great, and I think y'all are going to love it as well, because I think she's going to preach right from the heart, just like what she did to me before we got on camera, where she just laid the Word of God right smack at my feet and reminded me of a couple important things. So that's what we're hoping for on Sunday. So tell us a little bit about the gospel today. Where are we?
Well, the gospel, we're with Jesus and the disciples, and they've come out, and Jesus says that no stone at the temple will be left here one upon another. They'll all be thrown down. So he's talking apparently about the destruction of the temple again, because we know that the temple was built and that it was torn down and rebuilt, almost torn down and then rebuilt again. The last one was, I guess, Herod, I think. Yeah.
Yes, and for those who are wondering where we are, we're in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. That's Sunday's gospel. No, thank you. And this is that interesting part where Jesus is talking about the temple being torn down. And now Mark, we know Mark's the oldest gospel. We date Mark early 60s. We know the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the 70s. So it's very interesting that the actual physical temple is going to be destroyed. But for Jesus to go around and say things like this is where they worship. This is where you do your sacrifices. It's hard to imagine Judaism surviving without the temple, particularly in Jerusalem. Now, let me just back out and give a little bit larger worldview. Since the Babylonian exile, which was a long time before this, they've developed worship away from the temple because they didn't have the temple for hundreds of years. And now they have the temple again. So there are, and this is where Paul's ministry is going to go much later, there are communities gathered, Jewish communities gathered that aren't based around temple worship. However, Jesus is right here in the heart of temple worship, telling these people, this temple is going to be destroyed. But what's interesting, I think, too, in this reading is everybody wants to know when. Don't we always want to know when this is going to happen? When
and
that's
how is it
happen?
going to affect me? Am I going to be involved in this at all?
It just speaks to two different things, I think. You just hit it right on the nail on the head. We want to know because we really are inherently selfish. We want to get our plans in order. If we can get our plans in order, and then we can take care of other people. But once I have all my ducks in a row. Now, there's some truth that we probably do need to take care of ourselves. It's like that old adage on the airline. I was just flying recently, and they tell you, and Becky's the pilot too, so this is even funnier. When they tell you when the oxygen mask drop down, put yours on first before helping the people next to you, because you're not going to be very good if you're passed out from no oxygen to put somebody else's mask on. So there's some truth to us being a little selfish and making sure, not selfish, but making sure we take care of self-care. So moving from selfish to self-care so that we can care for others. That's one thing. But what Peter and James here and John and Andrew are really wanting to know as disciples, tell us when.
When?
We want to know exactly when it's going to happen. And Jesus gives all these wonderful things that are going to happen. It basically tells them, stop worrying about it. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. Because how long, now I was born in the 80s, but I can think from the time I was born until now, at different points in our history, where people have tried to gather large groups of Christians together to say, this is it. We have figured it out. This is the end.
Get all your stuff together. Your insurance policies can go out the door. Put your money in certain places because you're going to need anything. Sell your cars, sell your houses.
And yet we're still here.
We are.
And I'm sure, and then I know times before I was born that had happened. And I think Jesus is always reminding us of the much larger picture. What's really important? What's really important to our life right now? And to bring it, I think, back to Hannah. How do we remain faithful to the gospel? How do we continue to proclaim the gospel, not worrying exactly when the kingdom's going to, well, the kingdom's here, but when's Jesus going to physically come back to earth? How do we remain faithful to the story? How do we remain faithful to the legacy the disciples left us with? How do we remain faithful to our story as a church? Just as Hannah remained faithful to God, even when she didn't know if she was going to get what she really wanted.
Well, and she was told to go. We know that she cared for her son. And then the disciples, we know, went out and told.
Went out and told. And I think that is the real thing. Go out and tell the story. And that's really, the readings this time of year are really pushing us, I think, out to tell the story. These are no different. How do we in our own lives tell the story? How do we go out and invite others into the story? How do we move from our kind of selfish interest into the interest of the betterment of the kingdom? And we're going to hear, not too long from now, we'll be reminded of the harvest again. As a matter of fact, when we get to Christ the King Sunday at the end of November, we will be reminded of that kind of kingship. And how do we respond to that? How do we tell that story? Because it's so easy to be distracted trying to figure out that this war, or this famine, or this drought, or everything that's going on that seems so bad and terrible, the world's coming to an end. The fires, politics, everything. You'll see people get themselves spun up thinking this is it. And we don't know.
We don't know.
But what we do know is we have to remain faithful. We have to trust. Final word. What do you want them to know as a final word before we part ways this morning?
That we all have a purpose in God's kingdom.
There it is, folks. Come on Sunday, 8:15, 10:30. Hear Deacon Becky bring us the word, as we like to say, bring the sermon, preach the sermon. And we'll dive a little bit further into these texts. Do check out more about us at Christ Episcopal Church on our website, christchurchtemple.org, or on our Facebook page. You can follow us. So thank you for tuning in for what's hopefully going to be the start of a cool series, Food for the Journey. Thank you.
See you next time.